Escalating trade war, the United States is releasing a list of an additional $200 billion in Chinese products to be hit with new tariffs. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States is publishing a list of additional tariffs on Chinese products worth $200 billion. This would be in addition to duties imposed on $34 billion in Chinese imports last week. Beijing immediately retaliated with tariffs on the same value of U.S. goods, including soybeans and cars. China has vowed to retaliate dollar for dollar to any further U.S. tariffs. There's much to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Afshin Molavi. He's a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University's Foreign Policy Institute. Michael Johns is with us from Philadelphia. He's a former speechwriter for U.S. President George H.W. Bush and the co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. Victor Gao is an international relations analyst and the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. He's joining us from Beijing. And also with us, my colleague, CGTN White House correspondent Jessica Stone. We call the program The Heat. It's perfect for today because things are really heating up. I know you just got off the phone listening to this conference call, kind of outlining what we're seeing. What did you hear? Well,
what I heard was the U.S. wants to negotiate with President Xi. They want a negotiation about how to approach this trade relationship person to person. China, on the other hand, as we know, wants to go to the WTO and has already done so with the last round. But this was already pledged by President Trump that as soon as he saw retaliation by the Chinese for the tariffs that the U.S. imposed on Friday, he would reciprocate with this $200 billion in tariffs. And you and I were looking through this lengthy list here of tariffs, and a lot of it is agricultural goods, which is going to be interesting to see how that plays out because, of course, a lot of Trump supporters in the United States are people who make or whose livelihoods depend on these types of items. One thing was very interesting, Mike. I asked the senior administration officials on the call, what are you looking for? What will show you that Beijing wants to move forward, in your estimation, with talks? And they said they were looking for meaningful engagement as defined by talking about China, Made in China 2025, talking about structural change, admitting from their perspective that Beijing's trade policies have hurt the United States. And they don't feel that they've been heard, and this is their effort to do so.
Well, let's turn to Victor Gao because, Victor, undoubtedly this is not going to go over very well in China. And, you know, the administration is saying they want to talk to China. We saw Vice Premier Liu He come here, talk, basically get a deal, go back to Beijing, then the deal collapses. It seems like they've talked and talked. They don't really know what the administration wants, do they?
Well, between China and the United States, the best option is always to talk and to negotiate on equal terms. But, for example, for the United States to agree to one thing, to negate on another thing, and then to turn the table on the whole situation is completely unacceptable. Now, what the United States is doing, historically speaking, is trade terrorism. And I think China is wary of that. The rest of the world is wary of that. The United States now has already triggered retaliation, not only from China, but from countries like Canada, India, South Korea, Japan, many EU countries, etc., you name it, including some of the closest allies of the United States. So China is not fighting against such trade abuses by the United States and by President Donald Trump alone. China has the other countries lining up on the same side against the United States, mainly because the United States is abusing its power, is putting itself on top of the WTO, and eventually will suffer the bad consequences. Now, for this round, $200 billion, for example, I think President Donald Trump is completely miscalculating, because between China and the United States, the total picture is not only trade in goods, but also trade in services, but also American invested companies operating in China. For the American companies operating in China, the total revenue on an annual basis is above $300 billion US. Therefore, if the United States keep levying such tariffs on the Chinese goods exported to the United States and corner China, China will have no other option but take actions against the revenues coming from the U.S. invested companies in China. And this includes a whole range of companies, including Ford Motor, General Motor, for example, you name it. And, for example, if China does the similar things that the United States has been doing to China, for example, blocking the Apple phone or iPad export from China, or levy tariffs on such products leaving China, Apple company will collapse in a matter of several months. And does the United States really want to go into a situation where China and the United States go full-blown into a full-blown trade war, eventually decimating both the United States as well as China? And I think President Donald Trump is completely miscalculating. And the consequences, if he keeps doing this, will be huge. And it will be a disaster for the United States, a disaster for China. And let me mention one thing. China has many characteristics. One characteristic President Donald Trump bear in mind is that it will not give in to pressure. So such unilateral pressure will even strengthen the resilience and the determination of the Chinese people, Chinese government, Chinese corporates, etc. China wants to fight this trade war against the United States tit for tat till the last minute.
Well,
if the two countries collapse,
well,
then China collapses because it's defending WTO, and the United States will collapse because it's violating the WTO principles.
And Michael, let's talk a little bit about what Victor's saying there. I listened in on this call as well with Jessica, and the senior administration officials were saying they're open to continuing discussions with China. But is this the way to do that?
Well, I think the president's been very clear. I mean, we have had an explosion of our trade deficit with China. Roughly $87 billion in 2000. That's now ballooned to $375 billion, largest in a history of our trade relationship. It's been based on theft of our intellectual property, on tariffs that are roughly 3 times those that we impose. Victor mentioned the auto sector. It's an important sector, obviously. China is imposing tariffs of 25% on our exports, our auto exports to China. We impose a 2.5% tariffs on theirs to ours. The president is very clear. He wants a fair trading relationship with China, and that can be accomplished, and it should be accomplished. I don't think the way to do it is through the threatening of the United States. I don't think it's through WTO litigation. The WTO has proved increasingly ineffectual, I think, for both countries in some respects. It is through the direct negotiations that I think the president is inclined to pursue, and it's got to be approached with an understanding that should have been reached many years ago, that this $375 billion trade deficit with the U.S., which is based on many, many unfair practices, including our joint venture practices in China, including subsidies of industry in China, really needs to be resolved. And if it can be resolved, I think you start to see the tariffs lowered on both sides, and ultimately maybe the freest trade relationship between these two great countries in the history of our relationship. So I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic. We're going through a difficult period of time where this president is executing on promises that he made. China needs to take them very seriously. And let me just say, this is one of the messages that I think China needs to hear very loudly and clearly. Do not think that this man bluffs. I mean, I think those of us who've been in his orbit, not just from president, but dating back beforehand, know one thing: he's a deadly serious man. He keeps his promises and he keeps his word. And he has promised the American people and the American voters that he will resolve unfair trade practices with China and several other nations of the world.
Afshin, I was reading Financial Times. They say every economist knows that the effective way to reduce a trade deficit in a country near full employment, which is the United States, is a recession. Is that what the U.S. wants?
Right. It's a good point, because it could be where we're headed. Look, if you look through history, tariffs, remember the great tariffs in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, which happened during the Great Depression. All economists will say it actually exacerbated the Great Depression. So this, at the end of the day, what President Donald Trump fails to see is that the China-U.S. economic relationship cannot be reduced to the trade deficit. This is a relationship of foreign direct investment on both sides. This is a relationship in which you have 250,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, and all of the money that they're spending, not only at the universities, but in university towns. This is the summer season, right? The vacation season. Last year, Chinese tourists spent $33 billion here in the United States. This relationship cannot be reduced only to the trade deficit, and I think that's a mistake. And lastly, the point that's worth making here is that China has become a great global demand engine, right? And global demand for agricultural goods, global demand for steel, iron ore, commodities. When China sneezes, emerging markets catch a cold, So these two large economies, they actually have a responsibility to the global economy to work together to ensure that the global economy is running smoothly, not necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts, because they're all selling into that same global economy as well.
Victor, I saw you shaking your head. Did you want to add to that?
Hello?
Victor, I saw you shaking your head. Yeah, did you want to add to that?
Let me add a very brief point. Indeed, there is a huge trade deficit between China and the United States. China has a surplus, the United States has a deficit. Both China and the United States are aware of that. And the deficit for the United States is not sustainable. The key is what to do with that. From the Chinese perspective, we have a huge demand, we have a huge market. The Chinese consumer market today, this year, is already larger than the United States, and it will continue to be much larger than that of the United States. Therefore, it is up to the United States to come up with more goods to sell to China, more services to sell to China, and this definitely will help create more jobs in the United States. You cannot have the cake and eat it. You cannot say, oh, there is a trade deficit, and then I would ask you to reduce the export. Who is exporting to the United States? It's not the Chinese government. It's thousands of companies, both Chinese companies as well as American invested companies here operating in China, and many other countries invested in China. Therefore, the whole picture is much more robust than what the President Donald Trump is coming up with. Therefore, for example, if the United States really want to shut itself from the growing consumer market in China, then be my guest. 10 years from now, China will be much, much bigger than the United States. And by then, it will be too late to try to re-engage the biggest consumer market in the world. Therefore, I think the United States need to do its homework, come up with more goods, including LNG, including crude oil, including many other things that there is a huge demand in the Chinese market for. Don't really hurt the interests of the American companies and the American consumers. Come up with a better way. Don't do the stupid thing. Don't do the things, the trade war, which eventually will be detrimental to the American people. The Chinese people want to be friends with the American people. And while we want to reach out to the American people, we want to buy more goods and services from the United States. We want to send more tourists and students to work and tour and study in the United States. This is the better way between China and the United States. For China and the United States to get onto each other's throats and try to destroy each other, holy cow, this is the worst that the world can witness.
Can I just add,
yes,
there's another miscalculation here by the Trump administration. That is the leverage that President Trump thinks he has. He thinks that the U.S. market is big enough to be the carrot here. It's the playbook from the 1980s. It's what the U.S. did to the Japanese with tariffs in the 1980s. And as a matter of fact, some of the same people are in the administration from that same era. And it just won't work because there are many, many American companies that rely far more on selling products outside the United States, and they need those trade relationships outside the United States more than they need to bring in products into the United States.
Well, and if you spend any time in China, you walk a half a block, there's a Starbucks. You see all these companies here in the United States falling all over themselves trying to get into this market. As Victor was saying, this is an emerging market. Everyone wants to tap into it. Are they closing the door to that? What does this do in terms of that economic step forward? Because as he points out, the more you dig in a war, the more the other side, I mean, it turns into a nationalism sort of thing. I mean, we saw with THAAD, you saw the Lotte stores, you saw Chinese consumers, they just didn't go. I mean, this can have that kind of impact on consumer brands from the U.S.
It certainly can. I mean, look, you know, capital is a coward, and, you know, businesses don't like this kind of uncertainty, even if it doesn't directly affect them, even if it doesn't directly affect McDonald's, for example, or Starbucks. You could have what you just described, where there's a reaction to McDonald's. By the way, McDonald's, Mike, is opening about one new restaurant every single day in China, right? You know, Starbucks dramatically expanding in China. A company like Yum Foods, Louisville, Kentucky-based company, generates almost half of its global revenues from China. So there's a lot of American companies making pretty good money in China, and there could be that local reaction against those companies. But more importantly, when you're making these kind of long-term investments, you don't like this level of policy uncertainty, and you may not be making these investments in the future.
Michael, you said he's a man of his word. He's going to stick to his word. But, you know, you've got the EU. They're retaliating against the United States, China, Canada, Mexico as well. Many targeting this Trump territory, the Midwest of the United States, aiming there. How long can he stay on this track if he starts to lose support there? And do you think that's a possibility?
I really don't. I think it's also a big mistake for China to be attempting to politicize the tariffs they're implementing against what they perceive to be the Trump base. I think that shows a lack of understanding of the Trump base, which will dig in even deeper. These are people very committed to resolving this particular issue. And while it is true that the $375 billion may simply be a number, you can be counted in workers of, you know, high seven-figure number of manufacturing jobs that's been lost because of unfair trade practices. The key to exporting and expanding U.S. exports and our trade relationship generally, expanding it on both sides, which I think has the potential to develop, is resolving these legitimate concerns that the president is raising regarding China's trade policies. It's true, as cited previously, that American businesses are active in China. Almost every one of them would cite these concerns as really serious issues that are impeding their ability to do business. We should not be having to transfer our technology to a foreign country. We should not be having to worry about intellectual property being stolen into the billions of dollars as it has been by China. We should not have tariffs that are 3 times ours. How with a straight face do you even complain about a modest tariff reaction when your tariffs are 3 times what ours are? And you know, honestly, this is all the public sort of discourse regarding it, and a lot of it is heated rhetoric. On a private level, as the president's correctly said, no one defends these trade practices, including the government of China. They're almost, I think, surprised that they've been able to get away with it as long as they have.
But Michael, let me ask you this, just to get back, Michael, if I can, just to get back to the earlier question. Heidi Heitkamp's in North Dakota. She's in a very tough race. It's leaning towards a Republican, but she said her trade war in her state is like a cow asking to eat a hamburger. And, you know, that's probably going to go over pretty well as this campaign continues till November, because when you look at that state, 98% of the gas, oil, hold on for just a second. 98% of the gas, oil, and grain exports go to Canada and Mexico. And then when you look at 2/3 of their soybeans go to China, it's going to hurt them, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, that's an obviously politicized comment. I mean, do you think that a vulnerable Democrat in a state that Trump won overwhelmingly is trying to build support for the president?
Okay, but how is a fact politicized? Because that's a fact. I mean, that is a fact.
No, it's a fact. Look, that's why we want to avoid a trade war. Let's be clear on that. And I think Victor said that. I think, you know, I think the administration, I certainly would agree with that. The key is to avoid that. But the way to avoid it is to resolve these underlying issues. And really, we haven't seen the progress that I think some had hoped within this first year and a half of the administration. Now I think there's an opportunity to sit down. And that I'm encouraged, as I knew would be in the call today, that the administration has made it clear they really want to have direct talks and to have those in a mutually respectful way, because I know China acknowledges that these are legitimate issues. And if we can resolve them, there's a great opportunity for China to expand its exports into the U.S. We're not concerned about that. It is true that this deficit is a number, but we have to be able to compete fairly. And this is not in any way close. This is the most unfair trade relationship in the history of global trade, and that's saying quite a lot.
Victor, he says it's the most unfair, but it seems to me that China has made overtures, has tried to meet in the middle, has tried to negotiate. We had one of our guests on the other night who said Trump's been very good at tearing up agreements that Obama did. He tore up his own agreement, basically made an agreement with China and then backed out of it. And China has this sense that they're being bullied, don't they?
Now, first of all, when President Donald Trump visited China in November last year, China agreed to buy a total of $270 billion US, or invest such amount in the United States. That's the largest trade deal ever announced. And for this year, there have been quite a number of exchanges of visits. The United States and China agreed to negotiate, and the United States actually agreed not to use tariff against China. That's the basis of the agreement that China entered into with the United States. Then, lo and behold, the United States negated on this promise, turned the table, and imposed a tariff again and again, including the recent announcement of tariffs on the 200 billion Chinese export to the United States. How can you deal with a country like that, who is not keeping its promises, who is changing its position again and again? This is not the United States. The United States under President Donald Trump is becoming a banana republic. It's losing credibility on the global stage, and it will lose its leadership role with Western countries as well as with the rest of the world. This is the very, very serious consequence that President Donald Trump is inflicting on the United States.
Michael, briefly, I know you wanted to say something.
You know, Victor, if we impose the same restrictions on Chinese exports to the United States that China has imposed on U.S. exports to China, that would be an immense escalation of a trade war and would be immensely devastating to this. Certainly, you would not consider that reasonable, but that implied in that is that China's existing policies are indefensible. And by the way, just so you're clear, your government is not defending your policies in private discussions with this administration. They're acknowledging that they're unfair. So the key is, let's get on with resolving it, because this could be a very important, and I believe is a very important relationship on a whole bunch of levels, not the least of which strategically, where I think we've taken a few steps back over the last few weeks. And I think there's a very important role for China to play in South Asia, obviously with the North Korea situation, and as a leader in the global economy, which we all acknowledge.
Afshin, let me ask you this. This was written in a piece, and I read it earlier today. I think it's a really good point. Sometimes the action seems intended to force China to eliminate its bilateral surpluses with the U.S., which Michael's talked about. Sometimes its aim seems to be halt the Made in China 2025. Sometimes it seems intended to remedy technology transfer. It seems like the goals are shifting all over the place. It doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, I want to get your take on this, that there's no real defined, I mean, if I'm in a negotiation with you and you say, this is what I need for us to make a deal, I can make a deal with you. But if it's this and this and this, but it might be this one day, it's pretty tough to negotiate, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. And you know, I mean, the Trump administration has been clear on the trade deficit number, that they have a real problem with that, and the Made in 2025. I mean, those two are clear. Having said that, underlying all of these that you just described is there is this conceit I think in the head of President Donald Trump himself, that America is getting played, America's getting exploited, China's winning, right? But the reality is, you know, here in America, I mean, we have the most dynamic economy in the world. We have the most dynamic private sector in the world. Our GDP per capita is almost 4 times the size of China's GDP per capita. You know, we have the most liquid capital markets in the world. There's a reason that China invests $1.1 trillion in U.S. treasuries, and they don't invest that anywhere else, right? So the United States is doing fine. Now, I understand that certainly there is a base a Trump base that is not doing as well. And I understand that there is inequality in the United States, and Michael talked about manufacturing jobs. But in the age of automation, first of all, a larger number of those manufacturing jobs were lost to automation. And as we increasingly automate, tariffs are not going to bring back those manufacturing jobs. So while I want Americans to do well, and I want the economy to do well, the reason that I fear these tariffs is because I think it's going to negatively rebound against the Trump base and the broader American economy at the same time.
And with driverless cars in the future, you're going to see truck drivers out of work as well. I mean, this is the eventuality that we're staring at. Jessica, you cover the White House all the time. It seems like there's these divisions within the White House as well. Steve Mnuchin might take one point, Peter Navarro. Any sense that anyone's got the president's ear on this?
I think what the conventional wisdom is now is that people like Peter Navarro and Robert Lighthizer, who are the more China hawks, do have his ear, and that Secretary Mnuchin, who's much more moderate when it comes to policy with China, has been sort of sidelined. So I think it's easy to see why Beijing would be confused, because they don't necessarily know that the person they're negotiating with is carrying the president's message on any given day. And people like Peter Navarro, I saw him yesterday and asked him about the trade war, and he said it's sort of like they started it. That's the response. That doesn't get us to the end result, assuming that's even true, and that's not what Beijing would say, that they don't agree that they started anything. They're just trying to develop their economy. So this tit for tat and who started who, this doesn't get us anywhere in terms of resolving it. And I don't think that the president and his administration, at least the hawks, understand that you've got to emerge from negotiations where both parties can say they've won something. Win-win.
It's a favorite expression in China. Victor, I'll give you the last word. Paul Krugman talking about this, one of the leading trade economists. He's arguing that if there's going to be a generalized trade war, all against all, that the world trade might shrink by 70%. It seems like Donald Trump's picking a fight with just about everybody. This thing can go in a real bad direction, can it?
Thank you. I think from the Chinese perspective, China does not want to have a trade war with the United States. But if the United States wants to impose this trade war with China, China will fight to the last minute. And if the trade war really blows out in a full scale, both China and the United States will suffer. And China wants to be a friend of the United States. We want to engage with the United States. We want to grow together rather than, for example, being imposed with all these trade war or tariffs. So wake up, the United States. China is a friend. China is a partner. Let's work together rather than destroy each other.
Well, we'll leave it there. Victor, thanks so much for joining us. I want to thank our panel for sitting in. It was a bit of the heat about a heated issue, tariffs. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.